Thanks, Anne and my mother, for those warm words of introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's delightful to be here, especially in this room, which I know as a kind of fellow traveler of Dorsey Derech. So it's fun to be here. I just want to explain that on your chair there's a handout which contains the passages that we're going to look at and discuss during the course of the talk today. So just have the handout at the ready, and I'll try to flag the relevant passages when I get to them. So today, basically, I'm just going to try to talk about what is Jewish political thought as an academic field, and why might this academic field be of interest to us today, even if we are not ourselves academics. And I think I'm not really going out on a limb if I say that we're at a crisis moment in Jewish politics, and maybe in non-Jewish politics as well, a moment at which the ideological configurations that have prevailed since the World War II period are collapsing before our eyes, and we don't really have any alternative configuration, right? There's no alternative configuration that is coming into view. So we're still waiting to see what's going to happen at this transitional moment. And I think it's precisely at a moment like this that we need to develop new conceptual frameworks, new vocabularies, new ways of thinking and talking about politics that can help us understand where we are today, and also maybe help us figure out, well, what are our alternatives at this transitional moment? What are the directions that are available to us as political actors, and specifically as Jewish political actors? So I want to argue today that we need a new political vocabulary, again, both to help us understand where we are, but also to facilitate a more sophisticated discussion about what our options are at a moment like our current moment. And I'm going to try to argue that the study of Jewish political thought could be one resource that could help us navigate this confusing time, right? So scholars who've studied the history of Jewish politics, the history of Jewish thinking about politics, they have a historical perspective and a theoretical richness that we can draw on in this moment to try to figure out where are we and where might we go. So, but before we can get to the discussion of where we are today and what options might be available to us and how scholarship might help us to understand and navigate our current predicament, we have to talk a little bit about the history of Jewish political thought as a field, the moment at which it was founded, and the political dilemmas that the people who founded this field were responding to. And I want to stress that I'm talking about the establishment of Jewish political thought as a field. So we'll see that Jews have always done politics, Jews have always talked about politics, Jews have always thought about politics. But it was only at a certain point, and a very recent point, namely the 1980s and 90s, that scholars in the academy thought we need to have an academic field dedicated to the study of Jewish political behavior and Jewish political thought. And when I say an academic field, I mean that they said we need to have conferences, we need to have journals, we need to have research programs like the program that we're having at the Katz Center this year. We need to develop courses for undergraduates and teach undergraduates about Jewish political history and experience. So this field, as an institutional presence in the academy, is a very new field, again, dating to the 1980s and 90s. And one of the things I want to talk about today is why, at this very recent point in time, did people come up with the idea to establish this field as a field? And, you know, we often think of academia as an isolated realm in which scientific objectivity prevails, an ivory tower removed from the rough and tumble of everyday politics, but we also understand that scholars are dependent on government grants, they're dependent on individual private donors for their livelihood, and you know, this funding and material support doesn't come for free, right? That the agendas of donors shape the intellectual and political priorities of the field. So I think it's important to remember that just like any other field, academic research is shaped by the world in which scholars live, and it's shaped by the pressures, both material in the sense of money, material and political, that these scholars face. So part of what I want us to get to, what I want to try to explain today is that an academic field like Jewish political thought has a history, and the research in that field is shaped both by scholarly debates and intellectual conundrums, but it's also shaped by the way that researchers are responding to the outside world. It's shaped by their sense of the pressing political demands of their time. So I want us to talk a little bit about the history of the field, the material and ideological and political forces that have shaped its development. And then hopefully at the end of the talk, we can get back to our present political moment and how some of the insights from this field might give us orientation that could help us navigate our current moment. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk first about the central kind of intellectual conundrum that scholars of Jewish politics have had to wrestle with in their attempt to establish Jewish political thought as a field, in their attempt to demonstrate that there is such a thing as a Jewish political tradition. And that question is the question of whether there's such a thing as politics without sovereignty. Can we speak about politics and political thought when the people in question, namely the Jews, were, prior to 1948, a diasporic people who did not have state power? Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to talk about. Then I'm going to look at two historically influential Jewish answers to this question of whether it is possible to conceive of politics when a people like the Jews lacks sovereignty, lacks a state. And we're going to look at these two influential answers because as we'll see, the two different answers to this question have shaped the development of the field of Jewish political thought. So then we're going to move on to a brief survey of some of the influential scholarly works in the field of Jewish political thought. And at the end, I'll come back to where we are today, where we now are occupying what I would say is a crisis moment in Jewish politics, or in more temperate language, a transitional moment in Jewish politics, and try to argue that if we kind of reconfigure the field of Jewish political thought in a way that gives us a much more expansive and flexible conception of the political, maybe we would have a richer sense of our options in the moment. Okay, so let's go to the first question, which is there such a thing as a Jewish political tradition? Now, again, I just want to stress, Jewish political thought didn't exist as an academic field until the 1980s and 90s, right? It was only at this point that scholars began to claim that there is a Jewish political tradition. There's a distinctive tradition of Jewish political behavior and thought, and that tradition is worthy of academic study, and that, in fact, for Jews to navigate the political world, they actually need to be aware of this tradition. Now, one of the interesting things to note is that when scholars first began to publish books about the Jewish political tradition, they often prefaced these books with an anticipation of skepticism on the part of their readers, right? They imagined that a reader would open this book and say, there is no such thing as a Jewish political tradition. How can you be writing a book about the Jewish political tradition? And so one of the interesting things is to think about why. Why were the founders of this field so, you could even say insecure, right? They were so insecure, so worried that people would greet them with skepticism and disbelief when they claimed that there was a Jewish political tradition. So I want to look at two passages quickly on the first page of the handout that might allow us to understand why is it that in the very moment that these scholars were proposing that we study Jewish political thought and behavior, they were nevertheless worried that many people would greet their efforts with skepticism, claiming that there is no such thing as Jewish politics. So if you look at the first passage on the handout, and specifically the sections that I have italicized, this is a book called Jewish Theocracy by Gershon Weiler, who was an Israeli scholar. And the book is largely an argument against the imbrication of religion with politics in the state of Israel, right? So he's arguing for separation of religion and state in the state of Israel. And so it's a very polemical book, and it's very engaged with current Israeli politics at the time he wrote it, which was 1976. It was published in Hebrew, and then it was published in English in 1988. And it's interesting that part of in the introduction to this book, in which he is again stating in no uncertain terms that there must be a separation of religion and state in Israel, he argues that there is no such thing as a Jewish political tradition, and the very term Jewish political tradition is a contradiction in terms. So he says, I'll just read this passage briefly. He says, the central thesis of this book is that the Jewish religion and the existence of this state, the state of Israel, are antithetical to each other by their very essence. It follows that it is impossible for a state which is Jewish in its essence to exist at all. Zionism was and remains a national movement, and in the context of Jewish tradition, it is a movement of rebellion and revolution. No compromise is possible between this movement and religious tradition. Therefore, no sense can be given to demands for a state according to the Torah, or to the counsel of those who lobby for shaping the laws of the state on the basis of the so-called political tradition of Judaism, right? He is mocking the very idea that there is such a thing. For no such tradition exists, and all who think, following Dubnov and others, that the institution of the Reish Galuta or the Council of the Four Lands are political orders have not even reached the threshold of minimal understanding in the matter of the essence of a sovereign state. Okay, so he's not mincing words. There is no such thing as a Jewish political tradition, and those who claim that there is such a thing misunderstand politics. And what's key for us is that they misunderstand politics because they don't understand what is required to establish and maintain a sovereign state. Okay? So clearly, Weiler is arguing that there is no such thing as a Jewish political tradition because politics is an activity that happens in a sovereign state, right? Sovereignty is essential to the definition of politics, and so a people who have historically been stateless, like the Jews who lacked sovereignty, were not capable of engaging in politics, right? So his argument is that a Jewish political tradition is a contradiction in terms because politics only happens within a sovereign state. Jews lacked sovereignty. That's the most notable thing about Jewish political history in the modern period. Therefore, it's a contradiction in terms to talk about Jewish politics and a Jewish political tradition. So already we're starting to see that the question of whether a Jewish political tradition exists, whether there is such a thing, is intimately linked to the question of whether there is such a thing as politics without sovereignty, right? Is politics something that only happens within a sovereign state, or can we think of politics as an activity that happens in multiple venues? Sometimes politics happens in a sovereign state, but you could also say that politics happens, at the local community, in the family, right? So there's a theoretical debate going on here about how do you define politics, what counts as politics, what kind of communities count as politics, and in the Jewish case, this is an especially controversial question, again, precisely because Jews lacked sovereignty, they lacked a state, and as Weiler is telling us, there's a very powerful tradition in modern Western political theory which says that there is no such thing as politics without sovereignty, right? That the state is the defining political institution. So if you're outside of a state, you're outside of politics. Now, if we go to the next passage on the handout, this is from the introduction to a volume called The Jewish Political Tradition, which I'm going to discuss in more detail in a few minutes. So I'll explain more about this text in a minute. But right now, what I just want to point out is that this book, which is arguing against Gershon Weiler, that in fact there is a Jewish political tradition. The project of the book is to recover this tradition and present it to readers. In the introduction to this book, Michael Walzer, who is the editor of the volume, he actually, again, he anticipates the skepticism of people like Gershon Weiler, and he begins the introduction, the very first sentence of the book is, the association of politics with the state is pervasive in Western thought, right? So he knows that in the Western tradition, it is conventional to associate politics with the state. He says, and he goes on to say, without statehood, sovereignty, and coercive power, there doesn't appear to be anything like political agency, nor therefore any point to the standard political questions, right? So again, the issue he's wrestling with is if the association of politics with the state is in fact the pervasive and dominant understanding of politics, then we might be led to the conclusion, well, there is no such thing as a Jewish political tradition because Jews did not have a state. They have an idiosyncratic political an idiosyncratic history that puts them outside of politics. But he's going to argue against Gershon-Weiler that is, in fact, the case. It is not the case that Jews lack the political tradition, precisely because the standard definition of politics is an inadequate definition of politics. So as he says in the last sentence in the paragraph, which I've italicized, he says, but politics is pervasive with or without state sovereignty, right? So he's saying, no, if you say that the state is the defining horizon for politics, you're wrong, because politics is pervasive. It happens in all kinds of venues, and part of what we're doing in this project of rehabilitating the Jewish political tradition is that we're expanding the definition of politics. We're expanding it beyond the sovereign state, and part of the value of studying the Jewish political tradition is precisely that it helps us to come up with a richer and more elastic definition of politics that allows us to see that politics happens in all kinds of venues, not just at the level of the state. Okay, so what I wanted you to see, just by juxtaposing these two passages in which these authors are debating, is there such a thing as a Jewish political tradition, is that the theoretical debate at the heart of scholarship in this field is a debate surrounding whether there is such a thing as politics without sovereignty and how you define politics. And this question is inescapable for modern Jewish thinkers, given the Jews' history of statelessness, right, prior to 1948. And so the real controversial question at the heart of all the scholarship in this field is whether the loss of political independence in the land of Israel in the ancient period, right, in 70 CE, does the loss of political independence in biblical times mark the Jews' exit from history and politics, or do the Jews remain a political community in exile, in diaspora, in the absence of a state? And then the kind of linked question is, what kind of assumptions about the political would lead you to adopt a given position on this question? Okay, so now what I want us to do is look at two views of Jewish political history which have been influential in our understanding of this question, and look at the two conceptions of politics on which these competing views rest. And I want to start with a passage from the theological political treatise of Baruch Spinoza, who, as you may know, wrote in the 17th century. He was excommunicated from the Jewish community for various reasons that we could go into another time if you're interested. But for our purposes, what's most relevant about Spinoza is that he's writing in a period, he's a contemporary of people like Hobbes and Locke, who really were the theoretical architects of the sovereign state. So he's writing in a context and a time in which theorists are trying to come up with a theoretical justification for the sovereign state and are arguing very strongly that the sovereign state is the sole legitimate or viable political paradigm, right? So these are really the people, and this is really the historical moment in which the association of politics with the state is born. And Spinoza participates in this theoretical effort of justifying and defending the sovereign state as the lone viable political model. And he does it, and this is what's relevant for us, he does it in part by telling a story about Jewish political history, right? Because in his book, he uses evidence from the Bible and a new reinterpretation of Jewish political history in the biblical period in order to justify the modern state. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how Spinoza does this and why it's relevant for our purposes. So in the theological political treatise, Spinoza, as I said, he insists that the sovereign state is the only legitimate or viable template for political community, and he does it by telling a story about Jewish political history, but he also draws out the implications of this new model of politics for modern Jews, for his Jewish contemporaries in the 17th century. Now, he uses, the story that he tells about Jewish political history involves offering a resolutely political interpretation of ancient Judaism. So he goes back to the Bible, and he tells a story about Moses, who he views as a savvy politician who essentially used religion to cement the state and encourage obedience in amongst the ancient Israelites. And one of the things that's important for Spinoza is that, as he interprets it, in the ancient Hebrew state, there was no separation between religion and politics, between civil law and religious law. Judaism in the ancient period was essentially a state religion. Now, perhaps the most famous or notorious conclusion that Spinoza draws from this particular interpretation of Jewish history is that contemporary Jews, like himself, contemporary meaning in the 17th century, they are under no obligation to observe halacha or identify as Jews. And they are under no obligation to observe halacha or identify as Jews because they are not citizens of the ancient Hebrew state. The ancient Hebrew state no longer exists. If Judaism was just the state religion for a state that no longer exists, then it's kind of incoherent to talk about Jews in the 17th century and say that 17th century Jews have to obey the laws of a state that no longer exists and of which they are not citizens. If it's the case that practices such as Shabbat observance and kashrut were merely elements of the civic and legal culture of a state that's now defunct, modern Jews born after the demise of the state have no halakhic obligation. Okay? So he's making a very bold claim that Rabbinic Judaism has no authority, and its claims are incoherent and betray a fundamental misunderstanding of politics. Now, for our purposes, what's relevant is less the radical rejection of rabbinic authority and halakhic Judaism that's going on here, but rather the conception of the political that he is operating with when he tells this story. Now, one thing that I think it's important to note is that when he argues that halakhic that modern Jews have no halakhic obligation, he's rejecting the rabbi's halakhic authority, but he's also arguing that rabbinic Judaism does not constitute a political community. Okay, so he's saying that individual Jewish communities, say the Jewish community of Amsterdam that excommunicated him, they don't constitute a political community, right? They don't actually have the authority that they claim to decide who's in and who's out. But he's also saying that Jews all around the globe do not constitute an international political community. And he's saying that because in his model, political communities, the only viable model of political community, again, is the sovereign state. So a Jew in Amsterdam is a citizen of the Dutch political community, and a Jew in Syria is a citizen of the Syrian political community, and it's impossible to conceive of Jews all around the world as one nation who share political bonds with one another. So in this sense, the demise of the ancient Hebrew state really marks the exit of the Jews from politics and history, according to Spinoza, because in a period of statelessness, Jews are not political. Now, what does this mean for the political options that he sees available to modern Jews meaning 17th century onwards? So now I want to call on a volunteer. Maybe I'll appoint my mother as the volunteer. I will volunteer her to read out loud the first passage on the top of the second page, in which Spinoza is going to talk about the political options available to modern Jews.
It's true also that they have survived for many years.
They is the Jews.
In spite of being scattered and without a state. But that is nothing to wonder at. After they separated themselves so from all of the nations, that they have drawn the hatred of all men against themselves, not only by having external customs contrary to the customs of the other nations, but also by the sign of circumcision, which they maintain most scrupulously.
Keep going. Yeah.
Moreover, experience has already taught that the hatred of the nations has done much to preserve them. I think that the sign of circumcision is also so important in this matter that I am persuaded that this one thing will preserve this nation to eternity. Indeed, if the foundations of their religion did not make their hearts unmanly, I would absolutely believe that someday, given the opportunity, they would set up their state again, and God would choose them anew. That's how changeable human affairs taxpayers.
Okay, so in this passage, we have both, we see that Spinoza has a very negative view of rabbinic Judaism, right? He's blaming it for sapping the manliness, the political vigor of his Jewish contemporaries. But the other thing that's important about this passage is when he speculates about, well, if it were possible that Jews could overcome this effeminate state that they've been reduced to by the rabbis, how might they re-enter the political arena? And here he says the way that they can re-enter the political arena is by establishing a Jewish state, right? And so Spinoza, the early Zionists loved Spinoza. They always claimed he was the first Zionist, right? Because he's one of the first people who really says Jews, perhaps one day they'll get their act together, they'll regain their manly vigor, and they will establish a state. Now, I'm less interested in, is he a prophet or not, and more interested in, again, what does this tell us about the way he understands politics? The way he understands politics here is that the only way he can envision for Jews to exercise political agency in the modern world is by establishing a Jewish state, right? He can't see them engaging politically in their local community. He can't imagine that they might establish a World Jewish Congress, right, and act politically through an international World Jewish Congress. The only way he can imagine them exercising political agency is through the establishment of a state, because, as I said before, he believes that there's no such thing as politics without sovereignty, that the state is the only viable political model, and outside of a state there is no such thing as politics. So that's why he can imagine Jews establishing a Jewish state, because that's the kind of mental framework that he's looking at the world through. Now, I do want to say that in other places in the Theological Political Treatise, he does outline one other way that modern Jews might exercise political agency, and that is as individuals who are citizens of democratic republics, they could exercise individual political agency. So that would be that, a Jew who happens to live in Amsterdam could exercise political agency just like every other citizen in Amsterdam, but that wouldn't necessarily be Jewish political agency, right? Because for that individual, their political identity is Dutch, and their Jewishness is private. It's just a private religious identity. So I think that we could say, if we wanted to kind of reduce Spinoza's vision to a kind of handy shorthand, because his conception of politics is state-centered, there are only two ways that he can envision for modern Jews to engage in political agency, and those two ways are either liberalism, right, that individual Jews engage in politics as individuals, and their Jewishness is just a private identity that's irrelevant for from the standpoint of the state, or Zionism, right? Jews can act together to create a state. So what I'm trying to point out here is that in a model like Spinoza's, in which there's no such thing as politics without sovereignty, in which the sovereign state is the only legitimate political paradigm, modern Jews have two options. It's a binary choice, either liberalism or political Zionism, okay? So now I want to move on to a very different view of the political possibilities for Jews in the modern period. And that is the passage from Simon Dubnov. And I'm going to ask for another volunteer, okay, to read it out loud. And just before you read, for those who don't know, Simon Dubnov was a journalist and a historian of world Jewish history, writing in Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century. And in addition to being a historian of Jewish politics, he was also a political activist, and he is best known as the theorist of autonomism, which was a form of diaspora nationalism. So it was an ideology that competed with Zionism in this period, argued that Jews should have national rights in their home communities in Eastern Europe. So instead of moving to Palestine, he said Jews should exercise their national political rights in Eastern Europe by claiming autonomy. Okay, so please read the passage.
In the social and political spheres diaspora life created as substitutes for state forms, autonomous communities controlling not only religious life but social relations in the broad sense of the term. education, social welfare, external relations with the state authorities, and so on. In most of the Eastern diaspora, the state delegated to such communities wide powers of regulation, taxation, judicial administration, including punishment of crime and the like. Even in modern Europe, the Jewish Kehillah, communal organization, the Kultusgemeinde of German states, the Consistoire of more limited authority in France, has continued as an arm of the state. Whereas in the United States, national or cultural minorities are largely ignored by the state officially. Jewish communities still carry on some public functions.
Keep going.
Keep going? Okay.
Yeah.
This Zionist rejection of Galut is criticized by a third group, the diaspora nationalists, who contend that the diaspora has survived for 25 centuries, not only because of religious unity, but also because it always preserved national autonomy and cultural institutions, organized communities, and unions of communities, and will continue to do so by adapting itself to new political and cultural conditions. At the end of the World War, a new formula for the settlement of national problems in general was proposed. In countries of heterogeneous population, the right of national minorities to cultural autonomy was officially recognized by international treaties and guaranteed by the League of Nations. Jewish national groups in several countries have partly obtained such recognition. Even Zionists begin to accept diaspora nationalism when they accept the fact that a large diaspora must continue to exist side by side with a small national center which may develop in Palestine.
Okay, so hopefully you can see that Dubnov has a very different interpretation of Jewish history. His interpretation is one in which Jewish history presents as a continuous, uniform, and largely successful quest for national independence. He says that Jews always sought autonomy. There was an indomitable urge to autonomy, to the maintenance of independent social and cultural institutions, and he actually sees this impulse, the impulse to independence, to autonomy, even when Jews are in diaspora, as the motor of Jewish history, right? From the moment of the destruction of the ancient Hebrew state, Jews were always trying to remain a self-governing community, and he argues they succeeded. They actually did succeed in maintaining self-governments in all the different places throughout the history of the diaspora. So his project as a historian involves documenting the various local institutions that diaspora Jews developed in order to maintain their autonomy. And it's interesting that in order to do so, he really places a lot of importance on and accords dignity to local institutions, like the humble community council, which might seem paltry compared to the awesome power of the state. Nevertheless, for Dubnov, it counts as a legitimate political entity because it is the institution through which Jews maintain a national identity, but not just a national identity, they actually govern themselves. So they manage to maintain genuine self-government. And you can see that in the second paragraph of the passage that we just read, he derives concrete political conclusions from his interpretation of Jewish history, right? So he says that Eastern European Jews at the turn of the 20th century should seek an updated version of the autonomy that Jews have historically enjoyed through the Kehillah. So he's arguing that Jews should participate in the emerging discourse of minority rights and demand local independence in Eastern Europe within multi-ethnic polities. So again, what I want to stress is that he and Spinoza are they have a fundamental disagreement about how to interpret Jewish political history, and they also have a fundamental disagreement about the definition of politics, right? Because Spinoza says there is no politics in diaspora. Dubnov says, yes, there is. Jews actually remain a political community, even though they're dispersed, and even though their communities are subject to the external laws of a non-Jewish state. So whereas Spinoza only saw two options for modern Jewish politics, what I call it liberalism or political Zionism, Dubnov introduces a third possibility, that of autonomy at the local level or extraterritorial nationality, right? That all Jews in the world somehow constitute a political community. And there actually are moments in Dubnoff where he goes so far as to say that this extraterritorial vision of nationalism is the highest form of nationalism. It's actually superior to a state-centered form of nationalism of the kind that we associate with political Zionism. So now, because we are running short on time, I'm going to turn to a brief discussion of contemporary attempts to constitute Jewish political thought as a field. And I wanted us to get there through the debate between Spinoza and Dubnoff, because part of what I want to show you is that these contemporary projects to constitute Jewish political thought as a field are still wrestling with these same questions, and they're kind of caught in a bind, that on the one hand, they're Dubnovian, but on the other hand, they're attracted to Spinoza's claim, and they actually like the state. And part of what's very interesting about these efforts to constitute Jewish political thought as a field is to see how conflicted and how ambivalent these scholars are, precisely about the possibility of affirming politics without sovereignty. So what I want to try to show you is how the founding scholars in this field are vacillating between the Spinozist model and the Dubnovian model. There are different interpretations of Jewish political history and of what counts as politics. But I think that when pressed, when push comes to shove, these scholars have always opted for Spinoza. They've always reverted to the idea that diasporic politics somehow don't really count. They don't really count as politics. They're inferior to the sovereign state. And the sovereign state really ends up as the ultimate model for modern Jews. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. And then I'm going to argue that at the end that I think actually we need to be more Dubnovian today and less Spinozist. So again, just for the sake of time, although we can talk about this more in question and answer, on the last page of the handout, I've given you the names of some of the founding scholars in the field and their work. And at the risk of injuring the pride of Philadelphians, I'm actually going to skip over the work of Daniel Elazar, who was a professor at Temple right now, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want, and focus on the work of Michael Walzer, who probably is the most prominent scholar working in this field today. So before I discuss his Jewish political tradition project, I just want to note a few things. One is that the field was founded largely by native English speakers who moved between the United States and Israel. So Daniel Elazar, American, taught at Temple, then he went to Bar Ilan. Michael Walzer is American. His colleagues, who he's working on the Jewish Political Tradition Project, are largely native English speakers who are also Israeli citizens and are working at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. So there's a kind of diasporic cultural orientation and intellectual formation at the heart of this project, because it involves Jews whose cultural and intellectual horizons are diasporic in the sense that they're simultaneously English speakers, Hebrew speakers, North Americans, Israelis. But at the same time, I think, and maybe to a surprising extent, their research, their attempt to constitute this field as a field, meaning found journals, research institutes, think tanks, undergraduate courses, published books, their research agenda was motivated almost exclusively by Israeli concerns, right? By a desire to contribute to the shaping of Israeli political culture. And they almost unanimously identify the establishment of the State of Israel as the impetus for their research program. And the claim is that now that we have a Jewish state, we need this academic field, and we need the field to provide us with an indigenous political discourse, a genuinely, authentically Jewish political discourse. And this position is controversial for various reasons, but essentially I just want to say that at the outset, largely what they're trying to do is provide Jewish warrants for secular politics, for pluralism and democracy, trying to provide Jewish readers with Jewish reasons for supporting or enhancing liberal democracy and pluralism in Israel. Now you can see this very clearly in Michael Walzer's project. So with several scholars from the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, he has published 2 volumes of a projected 4-volume work called The Jewish Political Tradition, which is an anthology. So it's an anthology that collects canonical Jewish texts from the Bible to the present on political topics. And the texts come from the Bible, rabbinic literature, medieval philosophy, and modern tracts, and they're paired with commentary by contemporary scholars. So they're trying to establish the canon of the Jewish political tradition, identify the canonical texts and issues, and publish them, in a handy anthology that can be used for undergraduate and graduate teaching. But they're also trying to invite contemporary readers to join and extend what they claim is an ongoing Jewish conversation about politics. And their hope is that these texts can, again, not just be used in scholarship, but that they can actually enhance public political discourse. Now, as we saw in the second quotation on the handout, which again was the introduction to the first volume of the Jewish political tradition, Michael Walzer recognizes that in order to posit the existence of a Jewish political tradition, you have to abandon the received association of politics with the state. You have to reject the Spinozist idea that there is no such thing as politics without sovereignty, and you have to instead adopt a Dubnovian standpoint in which, as Michael Walzer says, politics is pervasive with or without state sovereignty, right? So the very premise of the volume, which collects texts from all different periods of Jewish history, is a Dubnovian premise. A premise which insists that institutions like the medieval kahal, the kehillah, count as bona fide political communities. And so one of the very interesting things that he and his co-authors are doing in the project is that they're trying to showcase the practical and theoretical achievements of Jews who, in the Middle Ages, for example, lived in autonomous communities, ran these communities, and generated a rich political literature reflecting on their own experience of autonomous self-government. So part of what they're trying to do is show, first of all, that rabbinic political thinking was very sophisticated, more sophisticated than we might realize, and that Jews in diaspora developed a very rich political discourse in genres like midrash, biblical commentary, and the responsa literature. And one of the things that's striking about this project is that they're devoting most of their energy to the translation of rabbinic political texts as opposed to the Bible, because they believe that rabbinic texts are actually more politically fruitful than biblical texts, because they see rabbinic discourse as a pluralistic discourse, as a mundane, this worldly discourse that is more consistent with the democratic aspirations of the modern political culture in general, but also of certain kinds of Zionism in the state of Israel. So I think one of the things that's striking is that even though Walzer is himself a Zionist and the project has Zionist motivations, he is rejecting a traditional negation of the exile and saying, actually, rabbinic texts are the most politically fruitful. Texts produced in diaspora are the most politically fruitful. And if we want to find Jewish sources today for democracy and pluralism, instead of looking to the Bible, we should look to texts produced in diaspora. So in that sense, Walzer's project is very Dubnovian, and it's expanding our conception of the political and demanding that we take seriously the political claims of communities other than the sovereign state. However, and this is the kind of ambivalence that Walzer himself is caught in, he has also recently written several works on his own, so not collaborative works like the Jewish political tradition, but his own take on Jewish politics, and these are some of the works that are listed again on the last page of the handout. And in these works, I think he's actually retreated from the Dubnovian position that he affirms in the Jewish political tradition, because in his work on the Hebrew Bible and in his work on what he calls the paradox of liberation, he actually ends up reintroducing sovereignty as a political standard and ends up actually lamenting that Jewish political history is insufficiently political. He argues that the Bible is an anti-political text because the emphasis placed on divine sovereignty doesn't leave enough room for human sovereignty. And he actually also, on several occasions, says things like, the rabbis were deprived the ability to participate in politics. They avoided politics because they lacked sovereignty. So, in short, he, in his most recent work, has reverted to a more Spinozist standpoint, in which he seems to have changed his mind about the possibility of diasporic politics, and is now complaining that Jewish culture is dangerously anti-political due to a combination of factors, some theological and some historical. So what I'm trying to say is that when push comes to shove, he's not really willing to relinquish the idea of sovereignty as a political paradigm. And I think his retreat is motivated by a variety of things, including his particular statist brand of Zionism and his desire to recruit the Jewish political tradition for his own project of trying to strengthen liberal forms of Zionism in Israel. Okay, so now briefly to what does this mean for us today? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about where I think we are today. I also, there's a short piece that I have written about where I think we are today, which is on the table in the back of the room if you'd like to take it on your way out. So I think we are at a crisis moment, or perhaps a transitional moment in Jewish politics for the following reasons. First, the death of the two-state solution, which I think is one instance of a broader crisis of liberal democracy in the West. There's the much remarked alienation between American Jews and Israeli Jews, the fact that there's an ideological divergence between Jews in America, who still largely uphold liberal values, and Jews in Israel, who no longer uphold liberal values. We are living in a moment in which we're seeing the rise of old new forms of anti-Semitism, certainly in Europe, but most recently in the United States, I think in ways that people may not have expected. But I think there are some interesting new wrinkles to this moment in which we're seeing the resurgence of very traditional forms of anti-Semitic discourse, but with a twist. So I think, first of all, there's the twist that while on the one hand, the specter of Jewish power is being raised, we are also in a period right now in which there are some very powerful Jews serving in the court of the king. And so, this discourse about the fear of Jewish power is also linked with what you might call the return of the court Jew. But it's also the case that Jews are being invited to join the ethno-national populist alliance. That, previously Jews were just viewed as a threat to national populism, but one of the bizarre things I think about the moment we're living in is that certain Jews are actually welcomed into the ethno-national populist alliance. So there's the figure of the Jew has a dual valence right now in nationalist rhetoric. The Jew, as the figure of global capital and internationalism, is certainly seen as the most potent threat to the nation. But at the same time, Jews in Israel are viewed as a paradigm for national sovereignty, right? So Jews are being, at least Zionist Jews, are being welcomed into the ethno-national populist alliance on the condition that they're willing to overlook anti-Semitism. And I think one of the bizarre things about this moment is that some Jews have turned out to be willing to overlook it, right? Some Jews are willing to overlook anti-Semitism and enter into this alliance. They've accepted the invitation. And I think that leaves us at a moment in which the fight against anti-Semitism, which used to be a rallying cry for Jewish solidarity, and used to be a thing that Jews of all ideological positions could come together against, it seems no longer to be the case, right? That the fight against anti-Semitism actually is a foundation for Jewish solidarity and a rallying cry across ideological divides. So I think the way I'd like to sum up this very fraught and perilous moment in Jewish politics, but also in non-Jewish and world politics, is that we're at a moment of increased contestation and debate surrounding nationalism and surrounding the viability and desirability of the sovereign state. So some of the most contentious questions in Jewish politics and world politics surround sovereignty, its integrity, and nationalism. And what I've tried to show you today is that these are some of the key questions with which Jews have wrestled historically, and they're also the key questions with which scholars of Jewish politics have long been wrestling. Jews have a long history of addressing these questions about nationalism, sovereignty, the meaning and importance of the state. And given their history of statelessness, I think they have a unique perspective on what counts as a nation and what kinds of political institutions can facilitate national self-determination. So while we're navigating a very perilous political moment, I do think we have a wealth of material on which to draw. But I think in order to draw on this rich material, we have to fight against the constriction of Jewish political discourse in the post-World War II period, in which it seemed like we had reverted to a Spinozist horizon in which we really only had two options, either liberalism or political Zionism, right? Because our model of politics was the Spinozist model in which the state really defined our political imagination. If you compare Jewish political discourse post-World War II to the Jewish political discourse at the turn of the 20th century, when there were multiple options, multiple forms of Jewish politics, I think you do witness a constriction and impoverishment of our political options. So part of what I want to say today is that for Jewish political thought to contribute to help us navigate our predicaments, we have to use it to get out of the Spinozist binary, in which it seems like we only have two options, either liberalism or political Zionism. And I think we need to get out of that binary, in part because both of these options, liberalism and nation-state Zionism, are in crisis right now, right? Liberalism is in crisis in the United States and in the world, and nation-state model of Zionism is in crisis and arguably is about to end in Israel. So I think at a moment when these options, which dominated the ideological configurations of Jewish politics in the 20th century, are in crisis, we need to bring in insights from Jewish politics, but we need to bring in insights that allow us to listen to the wisdom of Dubnov, precisely because he lets us get out of this binary in which I think we're trapped. So my kind of concluding exhortation to you is that I think, in the post-World War period, people said things like, well, Dubnov was refuted by history. But I think now we're in a moment in which it's not so clear that Dubnov was refuted by history, right? At a moment when American liberals are defending sanctuary cities and embracing states' rights, and Israelis and Palestinians across the ideological spectrum are experimenting with various forms of federalism and shared sovereignty. It no longer seems so obvious that Dubnov was refuted by history. So I think at this moment of intense contestation surrounding the future of the sovereign nation state, Jewish political thought is increasingly relevant, especially if we use Jewish political thought to expand our conception of politics and our conception of the possible ideological options available to us, and recognize that it provides us with a historically informed account of the possibilities and perils of politics without sovereignty. So I'll stop there. So I welcome questions, comments. Yeah.
Please say more about what you mean by Jews participating in anti-Semitism in order to participate in larger systems.
I guess what I was trying to say is that, and again, people here who are older than me can chime in on this, but my sense is that, the fight against anti-Semitism really always was a unifying force in Jewish politics, and that, Jews who disagreed vehemently on, say, different issues surrounding Zionism, nevertheless agreed that we all had to get together to combat anti-Semitism. And I do think that now we seem to be at a moment in which some Jews seem willing to enter into alliance with anti-Semitism for cynical reasons of instrumental calculation, right? They think, Trump ostensibly supports Israel, therefore I will overlook the anti-Semitic statements that are published on Breitbart because it's in my interest to, get certain policies that are going to be friendly to Israel. And I think that does represent a change of some kind in the Jewish political outlook, that there's just a willingness to say, I'll put anti-Semitism to the side in order to enhance my agenda, which I think is a naive move, but I think it also makes Jewish solidarity more difficult because, again, I think that the fight against anti-Semitism really was a basis for Jewish solidarity throughout the 20th century, and that may no longer be the case. So that was partly what I was trying to say about where I think we are historically. Yeah.
The issue about complacency of the Jewish people, this is the Dubnovian model, in which within a country we become more and more accepted and we are free. Germany would be an example, possibly the Soviet Union as well, in which the Jews refused to leave because they were Germans during World War II. And that model didn't seem to work, and it seems as if we're kind of the last point you made. We're kind of heading into that. We're going to make a deal with the devil to allow ourselves to have a state, as opposed to allowing values be the guide.
Right. Although I just want to clarify that. The situation of Jews in Germany is not what Dubnov was arguing for, right? Because the model in Germany prior to World War II was a more liberal model in which Jews as individuals were citizens in the German state, but Jews did not collectively have national rights. So what Dubnov is arguing for, and this was an argument that largely prevailed in Eastern Europe and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which were large multi-ethnic empires, he was arguing that Jews, first of all, that they constitute a nation. So Judaism is not just a private religious commitment that I as an individual uphold, but it's a national identity. And as a nation, Jews deserve national rights, and they should demand and exercise those rights through autonomous local communities in their places of residence. So it's kind of like, the relationship of Pennsylvania to the United States of America. The Jews were asking for something like Pennsylvania. And it's worth noting that in this time period, other national minorities in Eastern Europe were demanding the same thing. So it wasn't just Jews who were demanding this kind of national autonomy. What's unique about Dubnov is that he's saying that the national autonomy that he sought for Jews in Eastern Europe is continuous with what Jews have sought and experienced throughout history after the destruction of the temple. So I think that's, I just wanted to clarify that about the nature of Dubnov's outlook, that it's not about Jews as individuals, it's actually about an alternative vision of nationalism. Yeah.
Dubnov was pushing for minority rights. He got minority rights. They were deadly and self-destructive during the entire first half of the 20th century. And he himself, who had options, got shot by the Nazis. The real issue that we're facing, I think, is, and it's right versus left, is the motto that Israel can either be a democracy or it can be a Jewish state. And that's being hammered from the left and from the right. I wonder if you'd comment on whether we have a way out of that syndrome.
Okay. All right. So I take it that there were two parts of your question. One was just maybe a reminder that Dubnovian autonomy, its utility in Eastern Europe ended with the Holocaust, and that Dubnov himself was killed by the Nazis. But then I took it that the second part of your question was something about how are we supposed to navigate the apparent trade-off between, right, Israel in its basic laws calls itself a Jewish and democratic state. But those two values have always been in tension in the real world of Jewish politics. They're increasingly in tension today, and it seems like Israel is at a point at which it may have to choose between Jewish and democratic, and it's no longer the case that Israel can claim that it is both Jewish and democratic with the continuation of the occupation, when, first of all, 20% of citizens within Israel proper are not Jewish, but also Israel is ruling over millions of non-Jews in the occupied territories. So I actually do want to say that a Dubnovian cast of mind might give us a different way to think about this extremely dire predicament in Israel, because I do think that the two-state solution is a Spinozist solution, right? The two-state solution is predicated on the idea that the state is the only viable political model, and the state is the only venue through which people can exercise national self-determination. So if we want Jews to exercise national self-determination, and we want Palestinians to exercise national self-determination, we have to create two states, a Jewish nation state and a Palestinian nation state. Now, as I think you all know, the two-state solution is in crisis, and I think now we are at a moment in which it's not clear whether it's ever going to happen, and we can debate why or why not, but that's not what we came here to do today. What I want to say is that if we had a different, more expansive view of the possible political institutions that could facilitate national self-determination, the death of the two-state solution doesn't necessarily have to mean the death of Zionism or the death of Palestinian national aspirations, right? Because if you had a more Dubnovian model in which you could realize your self-determination not through the establishment of a sovereign state with borders and an army, but rather through a form of local autonomy or overlapping sovereignties or shared sovereignties, then I think it would be possible for Jews and Palestinians to recognize their national aspirations and engage in democratic self-determination without separation into two states. And there are various movements in Israel that I mentioned briefly, and if people are interested, I can talk more about, that are trying to figure out alternatives to the two-state solution that do adopt, again, a more Dubnovian outlook in which instead of saying, you know, the only way to resolve this situation is to separate into two sovereign states with strict borders and armies and passports, instead let's try to think about ways of facilitating local autonomy, overlapping forms of sovereignty, shared sovereignty. So I think that's a place in which if we moved away from this Spinozist mindset and incorporated more Dubnovian insights, we would actually have more creative solutions to the dire predicament in Israel. Yeah.
Along those lines, I know that there were people who were proposing a binationalism, people like Judah Magnus and others.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether those kinds of battles would speak to the kind of structure that you were just discussing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing I should say is that there actually is a very long history of federalism within Zionism. So we usually think, I think mistakenly, because Herzl's book was called The Jewish State, that Zionism was a movement for the establishment of a Jewish state of the kind that we have now in Israel, a mono-ethnic national state. But if you look into the history of Zionism, you'll see that actually, first of all, Zionists didn't talk about the state very much at all. That wasn't the primary concern of many Zionists. They were much more interested in trying to figure out how to solve the economic crisis of Jews in Eastern Europe, how to facilitate Jewish cultural revival in an age of secularism. But it's also the case that when they actually did try to think concretely about political models, what kind of political models can we build in the land of Israel, many of them advocated for various forms of federalism. And the most famous are people like who are associated with Brit Shalom, like Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem and Magnus, people who are on the left and argued for binationalism in a very strong and robust sense. But I think what people don't realize is that even mainstream Zionists like Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky also were advocates of various federal arrangements. And I think that part of the history of Zionism kind of got lost because at the end of the day, due to various historical contingencies, what we ended up with in Israel was a mono-ethnic sovereign state that doesn't have any of this federalism. But it's worth noting that there's a very long history of federalism within Zionism, and it's not just some wacko new idea that people are introducing today. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you. I've never thought about Jewish political thought. I want to go back to college. I wonder though if you could say something from a Jewish political thought perspective on America today and assimilation and intermarriage versus what seem to be kind of the strongest Jewish communities, which are the Orthodox communities. I would imagine that's something that is thought about within Jewish political thought. So could you share
Yes.
a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, there may be other people in the room who have more expertise on this topic than I do, but I guess one thing I will say is that, again, going back to Dubnov, is that in his early writings, when he talks about America, he says, America is the place where Jews are really going to be able to realize this vision of diaspora nationalism because of the freedoms of America, like, and the absence of anti-Semitism. It is in America that Jews will achieve an autonomous national life. Very quickly, he understood it was the opposite, right? that there's something about American liberal culture that erodes a Jewish national identity, and again, encourages the transformation of Judaism into something much more like a private identity, a cultural identity, or a religious identity. And American Judaism, I think in that sense, is much less national and much more Protestant. We think of it as a faith commitment rather than a national identity, or it's hard for us to imagine, like, what would it mean for us in America today to view ourselves as a national collective? So I do think a lot of the debates about intermarriage are circling around these issues, but maybe are not fully conscious enough of the theoretical issues at stake. And I think a lot of the debate still is taking place at this very kind of consumer-driven level, which is, we're just confronted with the social fact of intermarriage, and we have to confront this social fact, which is true that we do. But I think while we're confronting it as a practical matter and a social fact, we also have to think about, well, what's happening to our conception of Jewish peoplehood or Jewish nationality here? Have we gotten rid of a notion of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish nationality? Maybe we have, and maybe that's fine, but you have to make an argument to justify it, right? So I guess on that level, I would encourage people when addressing the social fact of what's happening today to maybe take a step back and think about, well, actually, maybe we need to have a deeper theoretical question about, do we still consider ourselves a nation or a people? And what does that mean? And how, in the particular circumstances of America, can we realize that national identity? If, again, there is a desire for a Jewish national identity amongst American Jews. Maybe there isn't. Yeah.
The latest report was that Trump is trying to re-engage Jordan as an alternative to the situation in Palestine. It seems to me that was a shock to Netanyahu, because Netanyahu was surprised, I believe, that Trump would then, after speaking to Netanyahu, started to get aggressive in relating to Jordan as the alternative to the problem.
I have not read any reports to that effect. I guess I will say that I think amongst Israelis there's this longstanding fantasy that, well, we can unload Palestinians on Jordan, but Palestinians don't want to be Jordanians and they don't see themselves as Jordanians. So, yeah, I think that that's a problematic fantasy. One last question, and it will be to Rabbi Rosenblum.
Thank you. First of all, it's really a delight to see someone that is part of, that grew up in our congregation and has really blossomed into such a wonderful scholar. It's
Thank
really
you.
It's challenging just to listen to you. I want to go back again for a moment to the Dubnovian vision of autonomous communities within a larger
Yeah.
polity. Most of the examples that I think that he would cite in his literature, I haven't read his literature,
Yeah.
but most of the examples of autonomous Jewish communities existed at the sufferance of a larger state.
Yes, yes.
And they weren't autonomous, they weren't independent,
Yeah.
they were only independent or autonomous to such a degree that the larger polity allowed it to be.
Yeah.
Now, if you apply some of those models to the Israel-Palestinian situation right now, I'm not sure how that would lead to a shared sovereignty, because even the two-state solution presumes that the Palestinian state is going to be disarmed,
Right.
and the Israeli state is going to be the armed camp, which essentially is saying that even as a separate state, it's going to be subject to the larger Israeli state and exist at Israel's sufferance.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure. I don't know what the implications of this
Yeah.
is, but I'm not sure what kind of a solution there might be in the future, and I'm increasingly distressed and,
Yes.
what's the word I'm looking for? Disheartened.
Yes.
I see less of a solution in the future than I ever have in my lifetime, and it's very, very disturbing.
Okay, so I'll make a kind of editorial comment / plea, and then I'll address three different aspects of the question. So the editorial comment / plea is that you are right to be distressed and disheartened, and I would just say from Israel that American Jews should be aware of how desperate the situation is in Israel. Okay, so that's the kind of editorial comment / plea. Okay, so 3 points. So you're right that the historical models that Dubnov is drawing on were their autonomy was a gift or a grant, right, of a higher authority, either an imperial authority or a national authority. So, I mean, he gives a list of examples, like he talks about the Reish Galuta, the exilarch. He talks about the millet in Turkey. Right? There are a whole series of historical examples that he uses to establish this claim that Jews always sought autonomy and they always found different ways to exercise self-government at the local level. Now, it's important for him to claim a Jewish pedigree for what he's advocating for in his own lifetime. It's important for him to situate himself in this larger Jewish tradition, but he's not saying, I want exactly what Jews had, in Turkey in the Ottoman period, right? He's saying, I want a modern democratic version of autonomy that will rectify some of the deficits that you rightly pointed to, right? That autonomy was given to local communities, as a grant from a higher power who might be able to revoke it, right? So he was trying to find a way of establishing local autonomy, first of all, that in which there would be more democracy inside the community itself, but that community would also be a democratic participant in some larger national framework. Now, so the second point I wanted to get to is that we now live in a period in which even sovereign states like the United States are subject to international law, right? So we're living in a period, certainly, that is often characterized by political scientists as a period in which sovereignty itself is weakening. And a lot of the nationalism that is sweeping the world today is a kind of reactionary formation against the erosion of national sovereignty by these international forces. So today, I think, even the strongest nation is still subordinate to various international human rights regimes. But it's also the case that in this period, we have examples like the European Union, which again is not a very healthy or robust example today, because the European Union is certainly in crisis, but I think it is an example of an attempt to reconcile local autonomy with some larger federal structure in which, nations in Europe have their own autonomous political systems, but they're bound to one another through a larger federation, which again is not without its own problems. So I do think that, so now coming to part 3, which is what could this mean in Israel and Palestine? It's certainly not the case that we would, you might say, oh, well, the Palestinian Authority that currently exists is an example of Dubnovian autonomy in the negative sense, right? The Palestinian Authority has some kind of nominal autonomy, but it is not meaningful autonomy. So if we're trying to move beyond a two-state solution, certainly the autonomy that would be granted to Jews and Palestinians would have to be a meaningful autonomy. It couldn't be the kind of sham autonomy that the Palestinian Authority has, in which supposedly they have authority over their community, but in fact they rule on the sufferance of the Israeli government, and the Israeli army, runs around the West Bank doing whatever they want. So I think the challenge would be to try to figure out a way to reconcile, first of all, to come up with a form of local autonomy that's a meaningful autonomy, but also to figure out what are the bridging political institutions that would, create some richer mode of civic existence between Jews and Palestinians. And I think that's the thing that's, the challenge that's hard to figure out. How could we have an autonomous Palestinian entity and a autonomous Jewish entity that are occupying the same physical space, that are on the one hand separate, but at the same time working in tandem? But there are people who are working on this issue, and there are a lot of models for how to figure out how to sort of tackle this very difficult problem and figure out how to come up with forms of overlapping and shared sovereignties. Whether they'll work, I don't know, but I'm just encouraging us to think more creatively, essentially. That's kind of the punchline of the whole talk.